The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Florence as Lorenzo de' Medici walked through the narrow streets toward the modest dwelling where Niccolo Machiavelli spent his final years. The year was 1527, and the great political theorist, now in his late 50s, had been summoned by the younger Medici heir who sought counsel on a matter of utmost importance, the raising of his son, in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to those who lacked the fortitude to navigate its treacherous currents. Machiavelli received his visitor in a study lined with worn volumes of classical texts, maps of Italian city-states, and letters from princes and merchants across Europe. His eyes, sharp despite his advancing years, studied Lorenzo with the same intensity he once reserved for analyzing the machinations of Cesare Borgia or the rise and fall of Roman emperors. "You come seeking advice on fatherhood," Machiavelli began without preamble, gesturing for Lorenzo to sit in a chair opposite his desk. "Yet what you truly seek is knowledge of how to forge a man from the raw material of a boy, a man who cannot be broken by the world's cruelties because he has already broken and remade himself according to his own design." Lorenzo shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the penetrating insight that had made Machiavelli both feared and revered among the political elite. "My son grows daily, Niccolo, and I see in him both promise and vulnerability. The world he will inherit is one where weakness invites destruction, where sentiment can be a man's undoing, and where those who fail to understand power's true nature become its victims." Machiavelli leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "Then you understand the fundamental truth that escapes most fathers. They seek to protect their sons from hardship, to shield them from life's harsh realities, believing that love consists in making the path smooth. But love, true paternal love, lies in preparing a man to walk over broken glass barefoot and emerge with his feet harder for the experience." The older man rose and walked to a window overlooking the bustling marketplace below, where merchants haggled with customers, children played between the stalls, and city guards maintained their watchful presence. "Observe those people, Lorenzo. Each believes himself the author of his own story, yet most are merely players in dramas written by others, by those who understood early that strength comes not from avoiding one's weaknesses, but from confronting and destroying them so thoroughly that they can never again serve as weapons in an enemy's hands." Part 1. The Architecture of Inner Fortification. Machiavelli turned from the window and began pacing slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back, a habit developed during years of diplomatic missions and political maneuvering. The first lesson every father must teach his son concerns the nature of human weakness and the absolute necessity of its elimination, not through denial or suppression, but through systematic deconstruction and reconstruction. He paused before a portrait of Cesare Borgia, the man who had served as the primary inspiration for many of the principles outlined in The Prince. "Cesare understood something that most men never grasp, that our greatest enemies are not the armies at our borders or the conspirators in our courts, but the flaws within our own character that make us predictable, manipulable, and ultimately vulnerable to destruction." Lorenzo found himself leaning forward, captivated by the intensity in Machiavelli's voice. "But surely you don't advocate for fathers to be harsh with their sons, to break their spirits in pursuit of strength." "Harsh?" Machiavelli's laugh was without humor. "What is harsh, Lorenzo? Is it harsh for a blacksmith to heat iron in the forge until it glows white-hot before shaping it into a blade? Is it harsh for a sculptor to chip away portions of marble to reveal the statue within? The harshness lies not in the process but in the failure to undertake it, in allowing one's son to remain soft metal that will bend under pressure, or unworked stone that will crumble at the first impact." The political theorist moved to his desk and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with observations gathered over decades of studying human nature in its rawest forms. "I have watched princes rise and fall, observed merchants build empires and lose them overnight, witnessed soldiers show extraordinary courage in battle only to be destroyed by their own vices in peacetime. In every case, the pattern remains consistent. Those who survive and thrive are those who identified their weaknesses early and eliminated them through deliberate, painful self-examination and reconstruction." He opened the journal to a page covered with his careful script. "Consider the young Giuliano de' Medici, your own relative, who possessed every advantage, wealth, position, intelligence, and the support of powerful allies. Yet he fell to the Pazzi conspiracy not because his enemies were stronger or more cunning, but because he maintained a fatal weakness, the belief that his noble character would protect him from treachery. His assassins understood his nature better than he understood it himself, and they used his very virtues as weapons against him. Lorenzo's face darkened at the mention of the family tragedy that had shaped much of Medici political strategy in subsequent years. You suggest that virtue itself can be a weakness? I suggest that any trait, however admirable in the abstract, becomes a weakness when it makes a man predictable and therefore manipulable, Machiavelli replied, his tone taking on the didactic quality that had made his treatises both influential and controversial. The father who would prepare his son for survival must teach him to examine every aspect of his character, his loves, his hates, his fears, his desires, his moral convictions, and his emotional attachments, with the cold objectivity of a physician examining a patient for symptoms of disease. Machiavelli moved to a cabinet and retrieved a chess set, placing it on a small table between their chairs. As he arranged the pieces, he continued his discourse. The game of chess provides an excellent metaphor for what I propose. Each piece has defined capabilities and limitations. The king, though the most important piece, is also the most restricted in movement. The queen possesses great power but can be brought down by the lowliest pawn if positioned incorrectly. Victory comes not from emotional attachment to any particular piece but from understanding how to use each piece's strengths while minimizing its vulnerabilities. He moved a white pawn forward 2 spaces. A man must learn to view himself as both the player and the pieces, capable of sacrificing aspects of his current self in service of his larger strategic objectives. The father's role is to teach his son this fundamental detachment, this ability to analyze himself with the same ruthless objectivity he would apply to an enemy's weaknesses. The morning light had shifted as they talked, and servants had quietly placed refreshments on a side table. But both men remained absorbed in their discussion. Lorenzo studied the chess position, recognizing in it a metaphor for the broader challenge of preparing a young person for a world that showed no mercy to the unprepared. You speak of destroying weakness, Lorenzo said, moving a black pawn in response. But how does a father identify these weaknesses in his son? And more importantly, how does he help destroy them without destroying the son's spirit or sense of self-worth? Machiavelli's smile was thin but not unkind. These are the essential questions, and their answers separate the father who creates a strong man from the father who creates either a broken man or a man who will be broken by others. He advanced another pawn, creating a small tactical complication. The identification of weakness requires systematic observation and testing. A wise father does not simply watch his son in moments of comfort and success, but creates situations that reveal character under pressure. He rose again and walked to a shelf containing several small objects: a dagger with an ornate handle, a seal bearing his family crest, a small vial of what appeared to be medicine, and a letter bearing an official wax seal. Each of these items represents a different form of power, and consequently, a different type of weakness that power can exploit. The dagger represents physical force and reveals cowardice or reckless bravery. The seal represents authority and reveals either the weakness of needing approval or the weakness of rejecting all guidance. The medicine represents dependency and reveals either the weakness of avoiding all risk or the weakness of ignoring genuine dangers. The letter represents information and secrets and reveals either the weakness of gossip or the weakness of naive trust. Lorenzo found himself studying each object with new eyes, recognizing how they might serve as tools for understanding character. You suggest that a father should deliberately test his son's reactions to these various forms of power and pressure? I suggest that life will test him regardless, Machiavelli replied, returning to his seat. The question is whether these tests will come when the father is present to help interpret the lessons, or later when the son faces them alone and unprepared. He moved another chess piece, creating a position that seemed to offer Lorenzo several appealing options, each of which Machiavelli had likely calculated to contain hidden dangers. Consider the merchant's son who has never been forced to negotiate a difficult contract, never experienced betrayal by a trusted partner, never faced the choice between personal profit and family loyalty. When these situations arise, and they will arise, he will respond according to his untested instincts, which may lead him to disaster. Compare this to the merchant's son, whose father has created smaller versions of these same challenges throughout his youth, allowing him to learn from mistakes when the stakes are relatively low. The chess game continued as their conversation deepened. Machiavelli's moves were precise and purposeful, each one designed to create educational opportunities rather than simply to win. The destruction of weakness must be undertaken with surgical precision, not brutal force. The goal is to identify specific vulnerabilities and then design experiences that will either strengthen these areas or teach the young man to compensate for them through other means. He captured one of Lorenzo's pawns, but in doing so, opened a line that Lorenzo could exploit if he recognized the opportunity. Take, for example, a son who shows excessive need for approval from others. This is a dangerous weakness, because it makes him susceptible to flattery and manipulation. The father might gradually withdraw his own approval for actions that deserve criticism, forcing the son to develop internal standards of judgment. Simultaneously, he might expose the son to situations where popular opinion conflicts with truth or justice, helping him learn to distinguish between genuine respect and mere pleasing of crowds. Lorenzo studied the chess position carefully, beginning to see the deeper patterns in Machiavelli's play. But surely there is risk in this approach. What if the son interprets such lessons as rejection or becomes cynical about human relationships? There is indeed risk, Machiavelli acknowledged, moving his queen to a position that seemed aggressive but was actually defensive, which brings us to the crucial distinction between destroying weakness and destroying the man. The process requires what I call constructive demolition, the simultaneous tearing down of flawed structures and building of stronger ones in their place. He paused to sip from a cup of wine, his eyes never leaving the chessboard. A father must understand that he is not merely removing undesirable traits but replacing them with more effective ones. The son who learns not to seek approval from everyone must learn to seek approval from himself based on objective standards of accomplishment. The son who learns not to trust blindly must learn to trust conditionally, based on evidence and verification. The son who learns not to fear all conflict must learn to choose his battles wisely based on strategic considerations. The afternoon was advancing, and the sounds from the marketplace below had changed as different merchants set up their stalls and the character of the crowd shifted from morning shoppers to afternoon traders and travelers. Machiavelli seemed to draw energy from these rhythms of urban life, the constant ebb and flow of human ambition and necessity that provided endless material for his observations about human nature. The architecture of inner fortification, he continued, using a phrase that seemed to please him, requires three fundamental elements: self-knowledge, self-control, and strategic flexibility. A man who possesses these qualities becomes very difficult for others to destroy, because he has already identified his own vulnerabilities and either eliminated them or learned to use them to his advantage. Lorenzo found himself making increasingly cautious moves on the chessboard, recognizing that every position contained hidden complexities. You speak of using weaknesses to one's advantage. How can a weakness become a strength? Machiavelli's response came with a move that seemed to sacrifice his queen but actually set up a complex tactical sequence. Consider Giulio de' Medici, who became Pope Clement VII. His illegitimate birth might have been seen as a tremendous weakness, a source of shame that enemies could exploit to question his authority. Instead, he learned to use this background as evidence of his pragmatic understanding of human nature and his ability to rise above circumstances through merit rather than mere hereditary privilege. He leaned back in his chair, watching as Lorenzo studied the new chess position with growing concern. Or consider Francesco Sforza, who transformed his status as a condottiere, essentially a mercenary with no hereditary claim to power, into a demonstration of his ability to succeed through skill and strategic thinking rather than accident of birth. His weakness became proof of his competence. The lesson seemed to extend beyond individual character traits to encompass broader questions of identity and social position. The key insight, Machiavelli continued, is that others can only use our weaknesses against us if we ourselves see them as sources of shame or vulnerability. A man who has thoroughly examined his limitations, accepted them as part of his reality, and developed strategies for working with or around them becomes immune to the psychological manipulation that destroys most people. Lorenzo made his next chess move with visible reluctance, recognizing that all his options involved some form of material sacrifice. This suggests a level of self-analysis that seems almost inhuman. Can a man truly examine himself with such objectivity? Not without training, Machiavelli admitted, beginning the tactical sequence that would likely lead to checkmate within a few moves, which is why the father's role is so crucial. The young mind is more flexible, more capable of learning to separate self-worth from specific traits or circumstances. An adult who has spent decades identifying himself with his wealth, his social position, his physical strength, or his moral purity will find it nearly impossible to analyze these aspects of himself objectively. But a young person can learn to see himself as a collection of assets and liabilities that can be managed, developed, or modified as circumstances require. The chess game was nearing its conclusion, but both men seemed more interested in the broader principles than in the specific tactical sequence playing out on the board. A father who succeeds in this endeavor, Machiavelli said, advancing a piece that would force Lorenzo's king into an increasingly constrained position, produces a son who cannot be surprised by his own reactions, cannot be manipulated through appeals to his vanity or fears, and cannot be destroyed through attacks on his self-image because he has no illusions about what that self-image encompasses. Lorenzo studied the board and recognized the inevitable outcome. "Checkmate in 3 moves, he conceded, tipping over his king. "I see the pattern now. You forced me to make choices that seemed reasonable individually but led to an untenable overall position." "Precisely," Machiavelli said, beginning to reset the pieces. "And that is exactly what life does to most men. They make decisions based on immediate pressures, emotional reactions, or social expectations, without understanding how these choices fit into the larger pattern of their existence." The man who has learned to think strategically about his own character development will recognize these traps, and either avoid them or walk into them deliberately as part of a larger plan. Part 2. The Forge of Adversity and the Cultivation of Power. As the afternoon deepened into evening, servants lit candles throughout Machiavelli's study, casting dancing shadows across the walls lined with books and maps. The chess set had been put aside, and both men had moved to more comfortable chairs arranged before a small fireplace. The flames provided not only warmth but also a hypnotic focus for their continued discussion. "The second great lesson a father must teach," Machiavelli began, settling into his chair with a glass of wine, "concerns the proper relationship between a man and adversity. Most fathers, motivated by natural protective instincts, seek to shield their sons from hardship and difficulty. This is perhaps the greatest disservice they can perform, for adversity is not the enemy of strength. It is strength's creator and most faithful companion." Lorenzo had found himself profoundly affected by their earlier conversation, recognizing in Machiavelli's words both the wisdom of experience and the harsh logic that had made the prince such a controversial yet enduring work. "Yet surely you don't advocate for fathers to deliberately create unnecessary suffering for their children?" Machiavelli's laugh was low and thoughtful. "Define unnecessary, my friend. Is it unnecessary for a swordsmith to subject his blade to extreme heat and sudden cooling? Is it unnecessary for a ship's captain to test his vessel in rough waters before entrusting it with valuable cargo? The question is not whether we will expose our sons to adversity, but whether we will do so thoughtfully and purposefully, or allow life to educate them randomly and perhaps catastrophically." He rose and moved to retrieve a leather portfolio from his desk, returning with documents that appeared to be letters written in various hands. "I have here correspondence from young men across Italy, sons of merchants, nobles, and artisans who have written seeking advice about challenges they face. With your permission, I will share portions of these letters, as they illustrate the principles I wish to discuss. The names, naturally, have been removed to protect their privacy." Lorenzo nodded his consent, intrigued by this glimpse into the private struggles of their contemporaries. Machiavelli selected a letter written on fine parchment. This young man writes, "Master Niccolo, I find myself in terrible distress. My father's business partner has betrayed our family, stealing a significant portion of our wealth through false contracts and bribes to city officials. My father has taken to his bed with grief and seems unable to act. I have never faced such treachery and find myself paralyzed by anger and confusion. How should I proceed?" He set the letter aside and looked at Lorenzo. "What do you observe about this young man's situation?" "He faces a genuine crisis that threatens his family's survival," Lorenzo replied. "His father's inability to respond has left him without guidance at a crucial moment." "True, but observe what else his letter reveals," Machiavelli continued. "He has reached adulthood without ever experiencing betrayal, without learning to distinguish between trustworthy and untrustworthy individuals, without developing contingency plans for business relationships, and without acquiring the emotional resilience necessary to function when trust is violated. His father's protective instincts may have preserved his innocence, but they also left him defenseless against one of life's most predictable challenges." Machiavelli selected another letter, this one written on simpler paper and a less refined hand. This merchant's son writes, "Master Niccolo, my father has always insisted that I personally oversee every transaction, verify every contract, and maintain detailed records of all business relationships. He told me that trust without verification is merely wishful thinking, and that even honest men can become dishonest when circumstances create sufficient pressure. Recently, I discovered that my most trusted clerk was stealing small amounts from various accounts. Instead of feeling betrayed, I found myself proud that my systems had detected the theft before it became significant. My question is whether my father's suspicious approach to business will prevent me from forming genuine friendships. Lorenzo could see the contrast immediately. This young man has been prepared for the reality of human nature, while the first has been protected from it. Exactly. Yet observe the second son's concern about friendship. This reveals that his father has successfully taught him to approach business relationships strategically, but may not have helped him understand how to apply different standards to different types of relationships. The ability to be simultaneously cautious in business and trusting in friendship requires sophisticated judgment that must also be developed through experience. Machiavelli stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the evening activity in the streets below. The cultivation of power, and I use that term in its broadest sense, meaning the ability to achieve one's objectives despite obstacles, requires exposure to graduated challenges that build both capability and confidence. A father must serve as both instructor and adversary, creating situations that test his son's judgment, resourcefulness, and resilience in controlled circumstances. He turned back to Lorenzo, his expression intense in the flickering candlelight. Consider the military analogy. No competent commander would send untested troops into major battle without first ensuring they had experienced smaller engagements, learned to follow orders under pressure, and develop confidence in their weapons and tactics. Yet fathers regularly send their sons into the battles of commerce, politics, and social relationships without any comparable preparation. Lorenzo found himself thinking about his own son, recognizing aspects of overprotection that he had justified as expressions of love. What specific types of challenges would you recommend? Machiavelli returned to his chair and selected several more letters from his portfolio. The challenges must be tailored to the individual's temperament, circumstances, and likely future responsibilities, but certain general principles apply. He held up 3 fingers. First, financial responsibility and the consequences of poor judgment. Second, social situations that require reading human motivations and intentions. Third, situations that demand leadership and decision-making under pressure. He opened another letter. This young nobleman writes about inheriting significant debts from his father's estate and being forced to choose between maintaining his social position and ensuring his family's long-term survival. He chose survival, sold properties that had been in his family for generations, moved to a smaller dwelling, and began learning commerce from a successful merchant. His former friends abandoned him, but he discovered both his own capabilities and the difference between genuine and superficial relationships. Lorenzo could hear in this account both loss and liberation. His adversity forced him to discover strengths he never knew he possessed. But now consider how different his story might have been if his father had gradually introduced him to these lessons. Instead of facing crisis management with an inherited disaster, he might have learned financial prudence, business skills, and the nature of social relationships through carefully designed experiences during his youth. Machiavelli selected another document, this one appearing to be his own notes rather than a letter. I have observed that men who achieve genuine power and maintain it over time share certain characteristics that can be developed through proper training. They understand that power is not a possession but a dynamic relationship that must be constantly maintained and renewed. They recognize that strength unused becomes weakness through atrophy, that advantages unexploited become opportunities for enemies, and that reputation unearned becomes vulnerability to those who test its foundations. He stood and moved to a map of Italy mounted on the wall, pointing to various city-states and territories. Each of these regions has seen the rise and fall of powerful families and individuals. In every case, decline began when the powerful became comfortable with their power rather than vigilant about maintaining and extending it. His finger traced the territories of several fallen dynasties, the Visconti of Milan, the Carrara of Padua, the Scala of Verona. All fell because successive generations failed to understand that power requires constant renewal through adaptation to changing circumstances. Lorenzo joined him at the map, recognizing in the geography a chronicle of political lessons. You suggest that comfort itself becomes a form of weakness? Comfort is not inherently weakness, but the assumption that current comfortable circumstances will continue without deliberate effort to maintain them certainly is, Machiavelli replied. A father who allows his son to grow up assuming that his family's wealth, position, or relationships are permanent does that son no favors. These things are temporary loans from fortune that can be recalled at any moment unless the borrower has developed the capabilities necessary to renew them independently. He returned to his portfolio and withdrew what appeared to be a personal journal. I have spent considerable time studying the question of how power is transmitted from one generation to the next. The pattern is remarkably consistent. The first generation creates power through necessity, hardship, and exceptional effort. The second generation maintains it through memory of the struggles that created it. The third generation loses it through assumption that it is their natural inheritance, rather than something that must be earned continually. Lorenzo found this analysis both illuminating and troubling, recognizing elements of his own family's history in the pattern. How does a father break this cycle? By ensuring that each generation faces genuine challenges that require them to redevelop and prove their capabilities, Machiavelli answered. This does not mean artificially recreating the exact hardships faced by previous generations, but it does mean creating equivalent tests of character, intelligence, and will. He opened his journal to a page covered with careful observations. The Roman patrician families understood this principle better than most. Young men of good family were expected to serve in the military, hold minor political offices, and manage family estates before being considered ready for greater responsibilities. These experiences served multiple purposes. They developed practical skills, created networks of relationships with other capable individuals, demonstrated the young man's competence to potential allies and enemies, and, perhaps most importantly, revealed to the young man himself what he was capable of achieving. The fire had burned lower as they talked, and Machiavelli added another log before continuing. The challenge facing fathers in our current era is that traditional institutions for testing and developing young men have become corrupted or ineffective. Military service often involves more pageantry than genuine hardship. Political offices can be purchased rather than earned. Commercial opportunities may depend more on family connections than individual merit. Lorenzo recognized the truth in this observation, having seen many contemporaries advance through influence rather than capability. What alternatives do you propose? Machiavelli's smile was slightly conspiratorial. A wise father becomes creative in designing experiences that serve the same developmental purposes. He might require his son to travel to distant cities with limited resources and specific objectives to accomplish. He might insist that the son learn a trade or skill that requires genuine apprenticeship to masters who care nothing for his family name. He might create business ventures that the son must manage independently, with real consequences for both success and failure. He selected another letter from his collection. This banker's son writes about his father's requirement that he spend 2 years working as a common clerk in a competing bank without revealing his identity or family connections. Initially, he resented this as degrading, but eventually realized it provided him with invaluable insights into banking practices, employee motivations, and competitive strategies that he could never have gained as the boss's son. The educational value of such experiences seemed obvious once explained, yet Lorenzo realized how few fathers had the wisdom or courage to implement them. Most fathers would worry about their sons being mistreated or failing at such challenges, and thereby they guarantee that their sons will be mistreated and will fail when facing much greater challenges later in life. Machiavelli replied sharply, "The father who protects his son from small failures prepares him for large disasters. The father who allows his son to face manageable adversity teaches him to handle unmanageable adversity." Machiavelli moved to a cabinet and retrieved a small wooden box containing what appeared to be gaming pieces, dice, cards, and tokens from various games of chance. These simple objects illustrate another crucial principle that every father must teach: the relationship between risk, probability, and decision-making under uncertainty. He arranged several dice on the table between them. Life constantly presents us with situations where we must make decisions without complete information, where chance plays a role in outcomes, and where our previous experiences may not perfectly predict future results. He rolled the dice, producing a combination that would have been considered unlucky in most gaming contexts. The man who has never learned to calculate odds, assess risks, and make decisions despite uncertainty will either become paralyzed by indecision or make reckless choices based on wishful thinking. Both approaches lead to disaster when stakes are high. Lorenzo picked up one of the dice, feeling its weight and examining its carefully carved surfaces. "Do you advocate for teaching young men to gamble?" I advocate for teaching them to think like successful gamblers while avoiding the destructive behaviors that characterize unsuccessful ones, Machiavelli clarified. The successful gambler understands probability, manages his resources carefully, recognizes when circumstances favor action versus restraint, and never bets more than he can afford to lose. These are precisely the skills needed for success in business, politics, warfare, and most other human endeavors. He gathered the dice and arranged them in various patterns. Consider marriage, for example. Surely one of the most important decisions any man makes, yet how many approach it with the same analytical rigor they would apply to a business partnership? They allow themselves to be guided entirely by emotion, family pressure, or social expectations without carefully evaluating compatibility, shared objectives, financial implications, or the probability of long-term success. The parallel between romantic decisions and strategic thinking was not one that Lorenzo had previously considered, yet it made immediate sense within Machiavelli's framework. You suggest that even love should be subject to rational analysis. I suggest that rational analysis makes love more likely to survive and thrive, Machiavelli replied. The man who marries based purely on passion may discover that passion alone cannot sustain a relationship through financial hardship, family conflicts, health problems, or the simple passage of time. The man who chooses a partner based on compatibility of temperament, alignment of goals, mutual respect and genuine affection has a much better foundation for building something that will endure. He selected playing cards from the box and began dealing them as if for a two-person game. The principle extends to friendship, business partnerships, political alliances, and every other significant relationship. The man who has learned to evaluate human character accurately, to distinguish between reliable and unreliable individuals, and to structure relationships in ways that align personal interests with mutual benefit, will find himself surrounded by strong allies. The man who chooses relationships based on immediate pleasure, convenience, or wishful thinking about others' motivations will find himself repeatedly betrayed and disappointed. Part 3. The Sovereign Self and the Mastery of Destiny. The evening had grown late, and the sounds from the street below had quieted to the occasional footstep of a night watchman or the distant closing of tavern doors. The fire in the hearth had burnt down to glowing embers, casting a warm, steady light that seemed to encourage deeper reflection. Machiavelli had dismissed his servants earlier, ensuring complete privacy for the final portion of their discussion. We come now to the most profound lesson a father can impart, Machiavelli began, his voice taking on a quality that suggested they were approaching the heart of his philosophy. It concerns nothing less than the nature of human destiny and man's relationship to the forces that shape his life. Most men live as subjects, subject to circumstances, subject to the opinions of others, subject to forces they neither understand nor attempt to control. The father who would truly serve his son must teach him to live as a sovereign over his own existence. Lorenzo found himself leaning forward, sensing that this final section would synthesize everything they had discussed into a coherent philosophy of life. You speak of sovereignty over one's existence as if it were achievable. Yet surely there are forces beyond any individual's control. Death, disease, the actions of powerful enemies, natural disasters. Machiavelli's smile was both acknowledging and challenging. You are correct that no man controls all the forces that affect his life, but you make the common error of confusing influence with control and external circumstances with personal response to those circumstances. He stood and moved to retrieve a final document from his desk, not a letter this time, but what appeared to be a carefully prepared manuscript written in his own hand. I have been working on a treatise that explores these questions in detail, he said, settling back into his chair with the manuscript. The central thesis is that, while fortune, chance, circumstance, the actions of others, determines perhaps half of our actions and their consequences, the other half remains within our power to direct. The tragedy is that most men surrender even that portion which they might control, thereby becoming entirely subject to forces outside themselves. He opened the manuscript to a passage marked with a ribbon. Consider two men who face identical disasters, let us say the loss of their family fortune through the treachery of a trusted partner. The first man responds with despair, self-pity, and paralysis. He blames circumstances, curses his luck, and spends his energy seeking sympathy from others. The second man responds by analyzing what happened, learning from his mistakes, developing new strategies, and systematically working to rebuild his position. The external circumstances were identical, but their responses create entirely different futures. Lorenzo could see the logic, yet something in him resisted the implications. But surely the man who trusted unwisely deserves sympathy. His suffering is real, and his loss was not entirely his fault. His suffering is indeed real, and compassion for suffering is a noble sentiment. Machiavelli agreed. But compassion should not blind us to the crucial distinction between productive and unproductive responses to adversity. The question is not whether the man deserves sympathy, but whether sympathy helps him recover his losses and prevent future disasters. Machiavelli turned to another section of his manuscript. I have observed that men who achieve lasting success share a particular relationship with adversity. They treat it as information rather than injustice. When something goes wrong, their first question is not, "Why did this happen to me?" but rather, "What can I learn from this, and how can I use this knowledge to improve my position?" The distinction seemed subtle but profound. Lorenzo recognized in his own life moments when he had responded to setbacks with self-pity rather than strategic thinking, and could see how those responses had prolonged and amplified his difficulties. The sovereign self, Machiavelli continued, begins with accepting complete responsibility for one's response to circumstances, regardless of whether those circumstances were deserved, predicted, or within one's power to prevent. This is not a moral judgment about fairness, but a practical recognition that responsibility is power, the power to influence outcomes through one's choices and actions. He set the manuscript aside and looked directly at Lorenzo. This may be the most difficult lesson for a father to teach because it requires him to model a way of thinking that goes against natural human tendencies toward blame, self-pity, and the seeking of external validation. It requires him to demonstrate through his own behavior that strength comes from within, that self-worth must be earned rather than assumed, and that lasting security comes only from developing capabilities that cannot be taken away by others. The fire crackled softly as both men contemplated the implications of this philosophy. Lorenzo found himself thinking of specific moments in his family's history when different responses to adversity might have led to dramatically different outcomes. "You mentioned earlier that a man who destroys his weak self cannot be destroyed by others," Lorenzo said. "I begin to understand what you mean. If a man has already examined his flaws, accepted his limitations, and developed strategies for working with or around them, his enemies cannot use these things as weapons against him." Machiavelli nodded approvingly. "Precisely. But the principle extends even further. The man who has learned to derive his sense of identity and self-worth from his own achievements, his own standards, and his own continual growth becomes immune to the manipulation that destroys most people. He cannot be controlled through flattery because he knows his own abilities accurately. He cannot be controlled through criticism because he has already identified his weaknesses and is working to address them. He cannot be controlled through fear because he has tested himself against genuine challenges and knows what he is capable of enduring. This description painted a picture of psychological independence that seemed both attractive and daunting. "Such a man sounds almost inhuman," Lorenzo observed. "Would he be capable of love, friendship, or genuine connection with others?" "On the contrary," Machiavelli replied, his voice warming with conviction. "Such a man would be more capable of genuine connection because his relationships would be based on choice rather than need, on appreciation rather than dependence, on what he can give rather than what he hopes to receive. The man who needs others for his sense of identity inevitably makes demands that burden relationships and ultimately drive people away." He retrieved the chess set they had used earlier and began setting up the pieces again. "Consider the difference between the chess player who must win every game to feel good about himself and the player who enjoys the intellectual challenge regardless of outcome. The first player becomes anxious, makes poor decisions under pressure, and finds little satisfaction even in victory because he fears his next defeat. The second player improves continually, makes better decisions because he is not paralyzed by fear of losing, and finds satisfaction in both victory and defeat because each game teaches him something valuable." The analogy illuminated aspects of human relationships that Lorenzo had not previously considered. "You suggest that emotional independence actually improves one's capacity for connection with others?" "I suggest that genuine connection requires two people who are complete individuals choosing to share their lives rather than two incomplete individuals hoping to find wholeness through merger," Machiavelli replied, making opening moves that seemed designed to create interesting strategic possibilities rather than to pursue immediate advantage. "The man who has learned to be content with his own company, to find satisfaction in his own achievements, and to draw strength from his own resources, becomes someone that others want to be around rather than someone who drives others away through neediness or insecurity." Lorenzo made his response move thoughtfully, recognizing that this game was serving a different purpose than their earlier one. This suggests a very different approach to raising children than what most parents practice. Instead of trying to make children happy, you would focus on making them strong. I would focus on teaching them that genuine happiness comes from strength, from the confidence that comes with tested capabilities, from the satisfaction that comes with earned achievements, from the security that comes with self-reliance. Machiavelli clarified, the parent who tries to make a child happy by removing obstacles, providing unearned rewards, and protecting the child from the consequences of poor choices, creates the illusion of happiness while actually guaranteeing future misery. He moved another piece, creating a position that offered Lorenzo several interesting tactical possibilities. Consider the merchant who gives his son wealth without teaching him how to create or preserve it. The son may experience temporary happiness from his spending power, but what happens when the inheritance is exhausted? Or consider the nobleman who uses his influence to secure positions for his son, without requiring the son to develop the skills necessary to fulfill those positions effectively. The son may enjoy the prestige temporarily, but what happens when his incompetence becomes apparent? These examples seem to illustrate a fundamental principle about the relationship between short-term and long-term well-being. You argue that true kindness requires what might appear to be temporary cruelty. I argue that genuine love requires the courage to do what serves the beloved's long-term interests rather than what provides immediate gratification. The surgeon who refuses to operate because the procedure will cause pain is not showing kindness to the patient with a life-threatening condition. The father who refuses to challenge his son because challenge might cause temporary discomfort is not showing love to the son who will face much greater challenges later in life. The chess game continued as their philosophical discussion deepened. Lorenzo found himself making moves that balanced immediate tactical considerations with longer-term strategic positioning, unconsciously applying the principles they were discussing to the game itself. The sovereign self, Machiavelli continued, must also understand the proper relationship between individual excellence and social responsibility. The man who becomes strong, capable, and self-reliant does not do so merely for his own benefit, but because such individuals are the foundation upon which prosperous and stable societies are built. He gestured toward the window, beyond which the city of Florence lay sleeping. A community of weak, dependent, easily manipulated individuals will inevitably fall under the control of tyrants or be conquered by stronger neighbors. A community of strong, capable, independently thinking individuals will create institutions that serve their common interests and will defend themselves effectively against both internal and external threats. This perspective connected individual character development to broader questions of political philosophy that had occupied much of Machiavelli's career. You see the raising of strong sons as a patriotic duty? I see it as a human duty, Machiavelli replied. Strong individuals create strong families create strong communities, and strong communities create strong nations. The father who fails to prepare his son properly not only harms that individual, but weakens the entire social fabric. He made a move that sacrificed a minor piece to improve his overall position. But the reverse is equally true. The father who successfully raises a capable, principled, self-reliant son contributes to the strength and prosperity of everyone around him. Such a man will be a better husband, a better father, a better citizen, and a better leader if circumstances call him to leadership. Lorenzo found himself moved by this vision of individual excellence serving collective good. Yet such an approach requires fathers who are themselves strong enough to implement these principles. What of the father who recognizes the wisdom of what you say but doubts his own capability to provide such guidance? Machiavelli's expression became both sympathetic and challenging. Then he faces the same choice that confronts every man at every moment. He can accept his current limitations as permanent, or he can begin the process of overcoming them. The father who undertakes to strengthen his son while simultaneously strengthening himself creates the possibility that both will succeed. The father who uses his own weaknesses as an excuse for not challenging his son guarantees that both will remain weak. The chess position had developed into a complex middle game where multiple pieces exerted influence across the board, creating both opportunities and dangers for both players. Lorenzo realized that his play had improved significantly since their earlier game, suggesting that the lessons of their conversation were already affecting his decision-making processes. There is profound hope in what you describe, Lorenzo said, studying a particularly complex tactical possibility. If these principles are sound, then any man, regardless of his current circumstances or past failures, can begin to improve his situation through better choices and more disciplined thinking. Hope, yes, but not false comfort, Machiavelli replied. The path requires sustained effort, honest self-examination, and the willingness to endure short-term discomfort for long-term benefit. Many men prefer to remain in familiar misery rather than undertake the difficult work of creating unfamiliar strength. He moved his queen to a position that seemed to offer Lorenzo a winning tactical opportunity. Yet something in his expression suggested the move contained hidden depths. Which brings us to the final element of the sovereign self, the understanding that mastery is not a destination but a continuous process. The man who believes he has achieved complete self-mastery has already begun to lose it through complacency. The man who understands that growth and improvement must continue throughout life maintains his strength and continues to develop new capabilities. Lorenzo studied the chess position carefully, recognizing that the apparent opportunity might be a trap, but also seeing that failure to act decisively could lead to a gradually deteriorating position. The parallel to life decisions seemed obvious. Sometimes one must accept calculated risks rather than allow circumstances to slowly worsen through inaction. The metaphor of sovereignty is particularly apt, Machiavelli continued as Lorenzo contemplated his move, because a true sovereign must balance multiple responsibilities. He must be strong enough to defend his territory, wise enough to govern justly, diplomatic enough to maintain beneficial relationships with other sovereigns, and humble enough to continue learning from experience. The man who achieves sovereignty over himself must develop this same balance of qualities. Lorenzo made his move, accepting the tactical complications in favor of improving his strategic position. Immediately, he saw that Machiavelli's previous move had indeed contained a trap, but one that could be turned to advantage if handled correctly. The sovereign self, Machiavelli said, responding with a move that demonstrated he had anticipated Lorenzo's choice, recognizes that true security comes not from the absence of challenges, but from the confidence that one can meet whatever challenges arise. This confidence cannot be given as a gift. It must be earned through experience, built through facing and overcoming genuine difficulties. As the evening drew toward its close, both men seemed to recognize that their conversation had covered ground that would require much additional reflection to fully absorb. The chess game continued, but at a more relaxed pace, with both players more interested in exploring interesting positions than in pursuing victory. What you describe, Lorenzo said, making a move that sacrificed material for positional advantage, requires a fundamental transformation in how most people think about child-rearing, education, and the relationship between parents and children. The implications extend far beyond individual families to encompass questions about social institutions, educational philosophy, and political structure. Machiavelli nodded, clearly pleased that Lorenzo had grasped the broader significance of their discussion. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that the raising of one child properly is not merely a private family matter, but a contribution to the improvement of human civilization itself. The father who produces a truly strong, capable, principled son has given a gift not only to that individual and his family, but to everyone whose life that individual will touch. The chess game reached a complex endgame where both players had limited material but multiple strategic possibilities. Like their conversation, it seemed to be reaching a natural conclusion while simultaneously opening new avenues for exploration. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, Lorenzo repeated, because he has become his own fortress, his own source of strength, his own judge of worth and accomplishment. Yet he remains connected to others through choice rather than need, through what he can give rather than what he requires. You understand perfectly, Machiavelli replied, making a final series of moves that led to an elegant drawn position where neither player could make progress without the other's cooperation. And perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion to our discussion. That strength ultimately creates the possibility for genuine cooperation among equals, rather than the domination of the weak by the strong, or the parasitic dependence of the weak upon the strong. As the fire burned down to its final embers and the night deepened around Florence, both men sat in contemplative silence, each absorbed in reflecting on principles that could transform not only how they approached the raising of the next generation, but how they understood their own continuing development as human beings. The wisdom that had emerged from their long conversation seemed to crystallize into a simple yet profound truth, that every father's most important responsibility is not to make his son's life easy, but to make his son capable of handling difficulty with courage, wisdom, and grace. In doing so, he gives his son not just the tools for survival, but the foundation for a life of genuine achievement, meaningful relationships, and lasting contribution to the world. The chess pieces sat silent on the board between them, having served their purpose as teachers in their own right, demonstrating through play the principles that words alone could never fully convey. Like life itself, the game had required strategic thinking, tactical skill, the ability to learn from mistakes, and the wisdom to understand that every ending contains within it the seeds of new beginnings.